Hey there, everyone. It's Jeremiah. A quick note before the show to give a plug to our Patreon account. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content like extra episodes and extended episodes. They get access to our Sticker of the Month Club, where we send out great stickers every single month. And they get access to our community Slack, where the community discusses the episodes and a lot more. If you'd like to support the podcast, if you enjoy the podcast, and you want to help us out, please consider signing up as a patron at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. That's patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Hey there, everyone. It's Jeremiah. This week's episode of the Neoliberal Podcast is a joint episode going out on both the Neoliberal Podcast feed and as an episode of Andrew Heaton's Political Orphanage podcast. If you're a regular listener, please go check it out on Andrew's feed. There's a link in the description. And if you're a political orphan listening for the first time, welcome. Enjoy the episode. Andrew, I don't know if I told you this, but in 2 weeks, I'm going to be eating bugs live on stream.
For pleasure? Is this like you're this is just the new, like the neoliberal podcast isn't working out that well, so you're doing this other thing?
Business or pleasure, ma'am?
Yeah.
No, so the story goes that our community, the neoliberals, were raising money for charity. They're raising money for malaria bed nets in Africa. It's a great cause.
Okay.
And like the genius
Very
that
nice.
I am, I said, hey, if you guys raise $100,000, I'll eat bugs. You know, like they'll never raise that much.
Yeah.
Well, apparently some guy stepped in and donated like $28,000 to hit the
Wow.
thing. Some, and they had already gotten pretty high otherwise, but some guy made the gap happen. So
Was that guy
Well,
your
I think-
sworn enemy?
apparently now. So
Yeah.
I went to
Yeah.
what I've discovered through this process is, number one, this is happening. Number two, there are websites where you can just buy like Cool Ranch crickets. Like,
Okay.
like
You know what? Okay, so
every
so,
Pringles flavor comes in
Can-
grasshopper, apparently.
I have a lot before we even get to proper introductions. I have a
Yeah.
lot. Wait, actually, hold on. Let's do proper introductions real quick, and then we can go back to bugs, and then I promise we'll get to identity politics for people that are confused right now. So, first of all, the man who's talking, that is Jeremiah Johnson of the Neoliberal Podcast. Hello, Jeremiah.
Well, thank you for having me.
And we are joined by Dr. Andrea Jones-Rooy, who is one of the wonderful people on the World's Smartest Podcast Network and the host of Majoring in Everything. Hello, Andrea.
Hello. You had me at Cool Ranch Crickets, so I'm
Uh-huh.
here. You can sneak in the identity politics later, but I'm happy to go Cool Ranch for the full hour. So
And good, excellent. And I am Andrew Heaton, the host of the Political Orphanage, and I have eaten a surprising amount of bugs.
Oh, yeah?
Jeremiah. Yeah, well, because I went to East Asia. I was doing stand-up comedy at East Asia about 3 or 4 years ago, and was doing Turner's Festival in China. And so I hopped around. I did some stand-up in Cambodia. I know all of the comedians in Cambodia, all 2 of them.
Right.
I'm friends with 100% of the comedians in Cambodia. And just bugs are a part of the cuisine there. And when my tuk-tuk driver, when we'd kind of run out of sights to see, would be like, I don't know, you want to go eat bugs? And I'd be like, sure, man. So I actually have strong thoughts on this. Like, I don't care for beetles so much. I do like larvae. And I I'll have to go through. I've got it written down because I was like, if I ever have a chance to eat that again. So anyway, point is, can I get in on this with you, Jeremiah, and try and get the political orphans to raise money for mosquito nets to end malaria? Because I'll eat bugs if we can. I'm going to say if we can get $300, I'll eat bugs with you.
You're going to hit that. So
I will give you $300.
there we go. So the story has a second chapter, by the way.
Okay.
This is going to be very romantic in a second. So this is being done, I think, in 2 weeks' time from when we're recording this. It's going to be done live on our live stream on our Twitch on February 14th, which is basically Valentine's Day, right? I think.
I
I think it
Valentine's
straight up
Day, like-
is Valentine's
Yeah,
Day.
so
don't even
I should
think
know
there's
this.
a-
I'm
you don't
married.
have to-
I
You don't
should
have to
know
hedge
this.
that.
So on Valentine's Day, I'm doing this, and I mentioned, in a previous stream, okay, this is happening. Somebody then donated $100 to the live stream and said, this is for you to get a hotel room at the Pod Hotel so you can literally be in the pod and eat bugs. And like fulfill that vision of the future.
I can think
That's
of
awesome.
nothing more romantic than you and your wife eating fried crickets, Lady and the Tramp style, on
Andrew,
Valentine's Day.
In the pod
I'm inviting
hotel.
you. I'm inviting you to an illicit hotel to eat bugs.
I'm down
Valentine's
for this.
Day.
So,
And that
no,
sounds like some weird sex thing. But
I mean, I'm
I mean that as literally as possible.
First of all, Jeremiah, I'm at a point in my life. I'm up for anything. Let's like I'm willing to try some stuff. I will be in New York though, because I've decided I don't think I'm going to line up a date in Austin between now and Valentine's Day. So rather than being sad by myself, I'm just going to fly to New York, see my friends, go to Marie's Crisis, which is my favorite bar where I get to sing show tunes. So as long as I can sing show tunes after or before I eat bugs with you, I will go to your illicit hotel room.
it's a plan.
I think the
It's a
whole
plan.
night needs to be live streamed.
Great, excellent.
Yeah.
We'll talk. However, we were going to talk about identity politics, and so I feel like while we'll work out the kinks on all of this, and I'll get the political orphans to maybe I should up the ante beyond 300 to like 380 or something. That said, we were going to talk about political about. Identity politics.
Yeah.
So for the kickoff for that, I feel like a good hook is President Biden and his forthcoming Supreme Court nomination. So Andrea, can you walk us through why that's in the news?
Oh, I sure can. I was hoping for some more Cool Ranch questions, but that's fine. I can do this too. So President Biden has said that to replace the retiring Supreme Court justice, he will make sure that he appoints a black woman to the Supreme Court. And that, not surprisingly, has caused a lot of people to get very wound up in a lot of directions. Is that a good summary?
I think so. I think you
There's
nailed
some
it. Yeah.
technical language in there, so you tell me if I need to.
No, Supreme Court Justice Breyer is stepping down. He's doing so as predicted for a normal Supreme Court justice, while there is a president of his party who's able to fill that gap.
Unlike that
so
RBG who just died in the middle of a
RBG
Republican-
and Scalia went, no, we're going to run out the clock.
Yeah.
You are going to pry the gavel from my cold, dead hands, and both of them made that work. But Breyer's going, no, I'd rather a Democrat appoint my successor. And yes, Biden came out and said he is specifically looking to fill not just the judicial role, but also to have a identity politics. He wouldn't say it this way, but to have an element of identity politics in it, and that is causing consternation. I think I'd put myself in that category, to be honest with you. I kind of when we get into this kind of thing, I'm at the point where I am fine with diversity being a tiebreaker. So that is to say that if there are 3 or 4 different qualified jurists that the president's looking at, and he goes, okay, well, 3 of these are white male Catholics, which is all of the men on the court at this time. It would be good to have somebody else's opinion. If they're all equal, I'm going to pick this other one to get an out. So I like that.
Right.
I don't like the idea of that being the preeminent criteria by which to select the jurists. And I also worry that whoever's going to be in there now is going to be presumed as a diversity hire for the rest of their career, even if they don't deserve it, which is very likely because it'll be picked from the federal bench.
Right. I think that's the main risk, and maybe it's not that interesting if I just come out and I'm like, Heaton's right. I agree with you completely. This is the first time on our podcast, right? Because it does do a disservice to whoever he appoints. And, I mean, Biden did something like this with the vice president as well. Where he said that he would appoint a woman, or he would, hire, what is the verb? Ask? Invite?
Deputize? Lieutenantize.
Deputize a vice presidential candidate who is a woman. And I think that in this case, it's even more specific, and it's a lifelong appointment, and it's such a fraught process. You can kind of make a VP whoever you want. You have to go through any Senate. I mean, there's an election, but it's...
You just draw a name out of a hat. Like
it's
George
almost
Bush
like
did.
he kind of played yes and with himself, and because it worked the first time, and I think it's a huge mistake.
Well, so I agree with you guys in terms of it being a political mistake. I don't necessarily think it's actually a problem, like a real problem in a policy sense, or that anything wrong has been done wrong here. But I do think it's kind of a political own goal. What my liberal progressive friends tell me is, well, look, Robert Reagan, the famous president.
Robert Reagan, the great actor.
Robert.
Ronald Reagan explicitly
Trickle-down
promised, but he explicitly said when there was an opening, I'm going to nominate a woman. And Donald Trump, to replace RBG, explicitly said, I'm going to nominate a woman. And of course, people didn't get mad at that because there's a weird intersection of progressives can't get mad for the reason that it's a identity politics woman candidate. They can get mad for a lot of other reasons, that they think Amy Coney Barrett is Hitler in her views. But
in fact, they did get mad. They were
yes,
real worked up about that.
They got very mad.
Yeah.
But it wasn't for the reason of that. And so to the progressives, it seems very, opportunistic, this anger about, an identity promise being made. And, I think they do have a point in that the standard is only going one way, and that, there's one crowd who will get mad at this only under the circumstances that we just want to be mad at the other guy. We're going to take that excuse that we now have to be mad at the other guy. But with that said, I do think that it's just an own goal. There was some polling that came out. I think 76% of Americans didn't want this kind of thing to happen, for Biden to come out and say that it's going to be a black woman. And one of the best takes that I've seen is that, frankly, Biden should have been prepared for this. Biden should have known that there's a really high chance Stephen Breyer was going to retire. He should already know who he's going to pick. And rather than say, I'm going to pick a black woman, he should just say, I'm going to pick, I think one of the prominent ones is like Ketanji Brown Jackson or something like that. He should say, I'm going to pick Miss Jackson. She's an incredibly qualified judge, and she's, nobody can doubt her credentials. Here's all her Ivy League and credentials. Just say her name rather than saying, I'm going to pick a black woman. Just go ahead and
from a
say the black
standpoint,
woman.
Have a little bit of a magician's hand feint of, Breyer is going to step down. Well, we're going to assemble a crack shot list of 10 justices. Don't know who it's going to be yet. They're all going to be really, really good. Happens to be this lady.
Yep.
We picked her based on qualifications and qualifications alone. However, she's also these things. I think that would have been more.
There's political jujitsu here where, because of what he did, because of the way he said it, now it's very, very easy to criticize. And people who don't pay attention to the news will kind of get upset about it. And this is small potatoes in the end. Like, this is not going to decide the 2022 midterms. It's not going to decide the 2024. But it is a little bit of an own goal. Mm-hmm. The jujitsu is that if you just say her name, and if you say, I'm nominating Ketanji Brown Jackson, then criticism becomes directly at her. And that's way harder to directly criticize her particular record, because it makes you look like more of an asshole go after her.
Another thing that it does, and let me say, amend something I said earlier where I said, I think it's a mistake. It's a mistake to say it the way he said it. I think appointing a black woman to the Supreme Court is a great move. And I agree with both of you that if he had just come out and said, here's a great candidate, let's go, that would have been a totally different scenario. But I think another risk is that it pits, and black women listening to this, please tell me if I'm wrong, it pits black women against each other. The same way when he said, okay, I'm going to nominate a woman as a vice president, all of a sudden we're thinking of this pool as citizens, we're thinking of this pool of like 5 possible women it could be, and it becomes this weird competition between the leading political women in the country. And I worry that he's going to do the exact same thing, and I'm speaking really out of turn because I cannot obviously speak from the perspective of a black woman, but as a non-man in comedy, it's the same sort of feeling where you kind of feel like you're all competing for the one spot that's not the man on the show. And Biden is almost just reinforcing that and saying like, hey, are you the black woman at this prestigious law firm? Well, you're going to be up against only other black women for this leading thing. And I don't know if that's a part of the conversation, but I feel like I could see why it might be. And that seems bad too.
I get part of the reason that I'm off-put by a lot of diversity-forward hiring initiatives within government specifically is a lot of the time I think they are somewhat disingenuous. And what I mean by that is I think if we're really interested in the concept of diversity, it would also be incumbent upon us to be interested in different perspectives, different upbringings, and different ideologies. Right. And my anecdotal
You're saying
experience
that the court, which is 100% Jewish and Catholic and 100% Ivy League, I think every single one of them has gone to Harvard or Yale.
I'm sure.
Yes, I think that's all right. Yeah,
it might actually not be correct anymore. It might be 8 out of 9 now. But there was a point where every single justice was either Catholic or Jewish, and every single one was either Harvard or Yale.
I believe that is still the case because Barrett is also Catholic. That's an example. I mean, I'll say it's a little bit different with the judiciary specifically because the judiciary is not and should not be making policy. It's not the job of the judiciary to attempt to sculpt American society based on their life experiences. It is 100% their job to interpret the law as it is. And I think that
is it though?
Yes, that is
I
straight
mean,
up.
I would challenge that. Also, I realize that saying the whole Catholic and Jewish thing makes me sound like an 1800s style racist, right? I should point out that I come from an extremely Irish Catholic family.
Yeah.
But I'm not doing the no Irish need apply thing.
Right.
But I just want to challenge you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to challenge real
away.
quick though, because there is a view of the federal judiciary that is, well, we're umpires. We're just calling balls and strikes,
Right.
and it's a very non-passionate.
Yeah, the correct view. Yeah.
And well, that's a political stance, though. That is a story the judiciary loves to tell about itself. But in a lot of senses, when you have a court that is trying to interpret the constitutional nature of how speech is regulated on the internet, and you have like people seriously writing sentences about how the founders would have interpreted text messaging.
Yeah.
Like that's nonsense. You're coming up with your own principles for what the law should be. You're not really at that point. You're so removed from constitutional questions as James Madison would have understood them. What would James Madison have thought about OnlyFans? Like that's stuff that comes up. And,
I would listen to that podcast episode, by the way.
And there's no concept of calling balls and strikes anymore. And you see this more and more, that there is a defined conservative camp and a defined liberal camp, and they're not exactly consistent in. Sometimes they're consistent, and they're not 100%. Like people like to point out, sometimes Scalia, sided with the progressives on something, but for the most part, they had their quirks, and we know what they are, and they're political quirks.
I hard disagree on all of these matters, and I'm going to push.
You think James Madison had a strict OnlyFans policy?
He did. He did. I've seen the James Madison daguerreotype pornography, and it was very tasteful and mind expanding. The main thing that I want to push back on is I think what you're basically saying is that the judiciary is just about naked power and partisan power, and everything else is a lie and a mantle that disguises that. And if that's the case, why bother having it? I mean, that to me is a terrifying prospect. That's basically saying that the judiciary itself is just unelected senators whose job is to push partisan agendas. I don't think that. I think
it's a mixture of the two, because it is about, there are some people who will say it's just about naked power. I'm not espousing that point of view, but you can think about it like, bureaucratic administrators of the state, federal bureaucrats who are running these giant departments, Department of Energy, Department of Housing and, Health and Human Services, and all of this stuff. And their job supposedly is to dispassionately interpret the laws that Congress has passed. But Congress cannot pass laws so detailed that they cover every single instance of how every single thing should be run in the trillions of dollars that we spend in the federal government. So in reality, there are ideological decisions to be made within these departments. That's why it matters who actually is running the Department of Energy and the Department of Education and all these things. And so on the one hand, they do have to follow the law. Congress has set guidelines for them and they have to follow the law. On the other hand, they have ideological stances they can take. And the judiciary is kind of like that. To some degree, they're calling balls and strikes, and they are interpreting the law. And that's why you do see a lot of 9-0 decisions in the Supreme Court. But there's also stances of, just that are pretty much partisan. Whether or not, a fetus is a human life in the abortion question is not something that you can find in the Constitution or, in real legal principles, unless Congress just passes a law that says it is. It's kind of just, we're all going to interpret it the way that, maximizes our politics for certain questions.
Courts in general, not just the Supreme Court, exist because exactly as you said, Jeremiah, and I even talked to some lawyer who said it this way once for an article I was writing, where it's like, the law can't possibly cover every single behavior. So it necessarily exists for times when we're in the gray zone, where it's like, is this legal? Is this not? Obviously, there's also evidence in like criminal courts and whatever, right? But it's not that they can just then only have a partisan agenda. I think that I'm going to give lawyers a little more credit than I normally do, which is to say that they do have to tether their arguments to reason and legal precedent and other things. And so generally, yes, in these split court decisions, we do see that people pretty much fall the partisan line, with some exceptions that we get all wound up about. But it's not like they're just saying, because, right? There is a burden of logic that they must prove and work through. And that burden has had consequences. Like, I'm going to mess up the details, but with the Affordable Care Act and like constitutional rights, didn't like the conservative side get very stuck in its own argument where they said that it was constitutional or it wasn't? Like, it's not like they can just say whatever they want. Like, it's somewhere between balls and strikes and just pure partisan whatever. And I say that as someone who's very skeptical of anyone in the legal field. It seems horrible. It seems like a horrible field to be in.
I love the legal field. I think I probably should have been. I should have been an attorney. I'd have the same wardrobe, but I'd be more successful. But I'll add to that like I find that I've spoken to several judges. I've read a bunch of judges, and all of them that are at that level agree that it is not their job, and I think mean it, that it's not their job to create policy. RBG would say that. Scalia would say that. The breakdown tends to be in constitutional interpretation, falling broadly along. Are we trying to do a faithful textual analysis, or do we acknowledge that some of the words in the text are variable, and those variables have to be interpreted based on where we are today? That's the fundamental breakdown between originalist and living constitutionalist logic. When they're just doing like, I really wish this had been a policy and Congress didn't get around to it, so I'm going to try and shoehorn it into my judicial decision. That's straight up judicial activism, which is generally abhorrent to both camps, at least rhetorically. But all of this being said, though, I will digress from this slightly, Jeremiah, and your wanton slander of the American judiciary by noting that all the same that their acknowledged role, and I think what they think they're doing, is to interpret the law. It's their goal is their stated goal is not to make it,
because they have dispassionate jurist as an identity. They've been a lawyer for so long that it literally has become their identity. I'm bringing us back around to identity politics.
No,
so I think there actually is an element of that there's a story that they tell themselves,
right,
and that they want to fulfill.
And I will say, no one makes me more nervous than people who think they are dispassionate and objective, because none of us are. That's a huge joke. And if we think that we are, whether we're journalists, politicians, Supreme Court justice, then we really get into trouble.
I interviewed a guy named Yuval Levine about a year and a half ago now, who wrote a book called A Time to Build, and one of the presumptions in it is that part of the problem we're having right now is that institutions have basically turned into platforms. That it used to be that you went into an institution with the idea that to some extent the institution was going to mold you and professionally sculpt what you were going to do based off of the criteria and norms of that particular profession, i.e. journalism, Congress, whatever, and that we've moved away from that to where people kind of become their own thing. And I think that could well apply to what you're talking about, Jeremiah, with identity with the sense of identity being somewhat inbuilt by virtue of going through a judicial process or something else.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, my theory of politics is that all politics is identity politics, 100% of it. And this is maybe a slight exaggeration, but it might not be. It might be literally everything. And, I think about the Federalist Society, if we're sticking with, nominating someone to the Supreme Court, that becomes an identity that people take on, that, progressive is an identity, socialist is an identity. If you want to get into broader politics, gun owner is absolutely an identity in the United States. And so when people say identity politics, they usually mean it in this current Joe Biden sense that, black people care about race issues, or women care about, women's rights or women's health access issues. But I think it goes into everything, that gun owner politics are identity politics, that people definitely identify as that. You look at what Donald Trump did in rural white America, and you tell me that's not identity politics, and I'm just going to laugh. I'm going to laugh and laugh, because what else could it be?
Or like a lot of the time, I think when we're talking about identity politics, we're typically discussing racial, sex, or sexual orientation in terms of identity politics. But identity politics, as you point out, Jeremiah, could be vocational as well. I am a teacher. I'm a union guy. I think that this is something that – well, actually, this is a question I want to pitch to you then. I know Andrea's familiar with Eric Grossman. I've interviewed Eric Grossman before. Or is it Matt Grossman? Anyway, Professor Grossman out of Michigan. His thesis...
Columbia, I think. This doesn't matter.
It doesn't. This is irrelevant. The theory that Grossman has, that I think has a lot to it, is that historically speaking, and Trump is a very big counterfactual to what I'm about to say, but historically speaking, the Republican Party has organized itself and expressed itself ideologically, whereas the Democratic Party has organized and expressed itself coalitionally. So Democrats, when they are looking at a situation and organizing, will go, okay, we've got our teachers union, we've got the gay coalition, we've got these various component groups which form our coalition, and we are going to facilitate legislation on their behalf, and that is our alliance. Whereas the Republicans have traditionally viewed it in terms of abstract thinking and ideology. Hence, pre-Trump, the primary for Republicans was about who is Reagan's ghost. Who is the reincarnated Reagan? Who's a real Republican versus a rhino, and that kind of thing. Now, do you, Jeremiah, do you see ideology just as a different form of identity, or does that theory militate against your principle that all things are ultimately identity politics?
No, I think it's still identity, and that ideologies become identities, especially in the modern age. How far back this stretches is a question. But, in academic departments, and Andrea, I'll defer to you here. You're the only practicing academic. But in your field, there are people who have bitter disputes. And there will be like in linguistics, which you're not a linguist, but in linguistics, there's the prescriptivists and the descriptivists. And those academics absolutely identify as one or the other. And, in foreign policy takes, you'll have the realists versus the internationalists versus the liberalists versus
social constructivists.
The Marxist, and these camps have bitter disputes, and they absolutely identify as one thing. And they love the people in their in-group. They hate the people in their out-group. They all have sacred texts the same way that a religion would. And you look at things like even labels like socialist. The modern socialist is somebody on Twitter who has a rose emoji in their handle because it's a way to signal that I'm in the in-group and you're in the out-group. And there's literally a whole list.
Economics book.
There's a whole list of like political emoji ideologies that you can find in these conversations. The neoliberals all have globes. The tankies have hammer and sickle emojis.
I've got a top hat.
The DSA kids have a rose emoji. Like there's YIMBY emojis. The YIMBYs have an avocado. Like literally things like I'm a YIMBY is an identity to people now. Yeah. And I think it goes all the way down when you think about being a neocon in foreign policy. It can be an identity when you believe it. And we're all, I guess my theory is that we're all a bunch of overlapping identities that just inform who we are. If I pick out somebody like Andrea, you're white, you're a woman, but you're also a comedian, you're also a professor, you're also a performer. And, academics have, as the part of their identity, I am a college professor, I'm an academic. That's deep in your soul part of who you are. When you're a comedian, that's deep part of
Andrea,
who you are.
You're a comedian. I just want to throw this out. You're an ethnic comedian. I'm sorry.
Deep part of my soul.
Wait,
my soul is turning in its grave at that. But okay.
I view all of us as basically these overlapping identities.
Okay. So you're everybody's, Jeremiah, just to make sure I understand, everybody's kind of a Venn diagram or a Jackson Pollock painting of overlapping identities in your worldview.
Yeah, and a lot of politics is determined by which identities can be activated. Are you activating the identity that says, I'm anti-abortion, or are you activating the identity that says I'm a black voter and I don't trust this other party? Because there's a lot of black voters who are anti-abortion, and it's a battle for which identity gets activated.
Andrea, I think you should respond since we mentioned all of your ethnic groups a moment ago.
Yes, I think so.
Do you want to weigh in before I do?
I'll weigh in first. So I feel very torn about whether I even need to bring this up, but because you have listeners who've heard me spiel about my own identity, I do not identify as a woman, but that brings up something very interesting, which is there's no way for you to know. No.
Apologies, by the way.
No need to apologize. But I bring that up because one's identity on the inside and how other people see them is also a whole complicated thing, and there are distinctions. But more than that, and I'm really, honestly, I'm such a coward about the whole thing that had I not been on Heaton's podcast, I wouldn't have even mentioned it, so great. But what's my point? My point is we think about identity in a lot of different ways in political science. And I was, in anticipation of this episode and this conversation, I was thinking about how we talk about it in political science. Because when we hear identity politics out there in the world, it is, and I think one or both of you touched on this already, it is usually meant as like a dismissive, anti-woke conservatives being like, oh, these liberals, right, with their identity politics. I think as a shorthand of saying, you're not paying attention to what really matters. You're throwing out your race or your gender and making that the story, and it shouldn't be the main story, right? In political science, Jeremiah, you're absolutely right that, identity, the role of one's identity in politics is its own huge field. And that can absolutely be your political identity. Do you identify as a Democrat or a Republican or conservative or a liberal or a whatever? And you're 100% correct that can be a huge part of how you interact with the world. And tons of academics have made tons of careers just understanding one's political identity, never mind all the others, right? There's also other research out there, and there's a journal, I can't remember the exact name, I meant to look it up, about the politics of identity. So we have identity politics, political identity, politics of identity. And the politics of identity is a little bit, Jeremiah, of what you were saying as well, where it's like, which one are we activating? Which is to say, like, are we all talking about race? Are we all talking about gender? Are we all talking about whatever? And is that going to get people worked up? And of course, that's what Trump has done. That's what a lot of people have done, right? But there's also the politics of identity in the sense that the identity that everyone has influences how they interact in a political system. So if I am interacting with the world as a Black person or as a disabled person or as a Catholic person, my experiences are very different and are therefore going to shape my political views as well. So there's this idea, not just that that identities are out there waiting to be activated like lightning striking. It's also an acknowledgement that my identity as a Latino, whatever, is influencing my behavior. So a lot of people look at it from like a bottom-up perspective, I would say, as well.
This is, all of these are fascinating points, and I don't know that I directly disagree with any of you. I'm just sort of processing these terms differently and using a different set of terms. But I'll say that on the note of, a Latino having a different life experience and therefore a different worldview, that sticks out in my mind by why I sometimes think these discussions are disingenuous. And the reason I bring that up is in a lot of academic settings and a lot of media settings, they'll say, we need to have a diverse group of people. We need to have lots of identities. And
since we started on the Supreme Court, wasn't there a Sotomayor quote about, as a wise Latina woman, something that people jumped on her for that quote?
She had sort of done a wink at the camera of before she was on the before she'd been nominated, of what the court needs as a wise Latina. She's sort of referring to herself, but lest I lose track of my point, the reason that I oftentimes find this disingenuous is someone's like, well, we really need to have like a Black man on the Fed. And I'm like, great, Thomas Sowell. Put Thomas Sowell on the Fed. And they're like, well, not Thomas Sowell. He doesn't believe the right stuff. And they're like, well, we need to bring a transgender lady. And I'm like, how about Deidre McCloskey? She'd be great. And they're like, well, she doesn't count either. And it's like, oh, okay, well, you don't like, a lot of the time that stuff is just sort of weaponizing ideology, where it's like, well, we've got this one very specific ideology that we're wanting to have. What we basically want to do is have different flavors of it. But we want everybody to agree to the same thing. And we kind of want to weaponize it too, because we don't want anybody to be able to argue with us. And that's why I get kind of flustered on this, where I'm like, well, I think ideological diversity is a positive thing. And a lot of the folks that are very much in favor of diversity don't appear to want to have ideological diversity.
Well, and Heaton, I thought you were going to go a totally different direction with the Latino example, which is to say that the Latino experience in the United States is far from homogeneous. And so to even ask a question like, how are Latinos going to vote, is a useless question. And we saw that in the last election, where Miami went very differently from what we expected, right?
Yeah, even from a racial perspective, there's extremely Black Latinos and extremely white Latinos,
exactly. Exactly.
Well, and I mean, to finish my tirade, I also think that most of the gains we've had over the last 300 years have been either seeing people as fully human as part of one race, or alternately viewing people as an individual. But the sort of worldview that everybody's a component of a race, I find highly regressive. So when we move in those directions of, well, you're emblematic of this tribe of people that you have no control over, that bothers me.
Well, and I talk about this with my data science students, so I'll crowbar this in here as well, which is to say that a fundamental tension in this whole thing is acknowledging both that humans, let's stick with the United States for simplicity, right? It's a famously simple place, so that's good. What you look like, how you present, and your life experiences and your family experiences and your ideologies, all of that affects your opportunities and your life and all. And we shouldn't pretend that the whole, I joked before we started recording that I'm just going to say that I don't see color, right? Everyone's, your skin tone, your size, your everything affects how you move through the world and the types of frictions that you run into. And so it's tricky to both acknowledge that without then reducing people, and this is where the data science comes in, I promise, without reducing people to these categories that I agree with you, Heaton, feel regressive to say, well, let's count up the Black people, let's count up the Latino people, let's mix all the Asians together. This is even a horrible thing to say, but that's what we do in this census. That's where all our data about diversity in the workplace comes from, is we literally went around and said, let's count the Black people, right? And you might say you're doing it to be thoughtful about the fact that different people and different backgrounds in the United States have very, very different life experiences, but it almost reinforces it rather than ameliorates it.
Well, can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
So the French take a very different approach to this, because you mentioned the United States. We literally have a census. We ask people about their race and about whether they're Latino or not, which is a weird, separate, semi-racial question that is separate from the other racial categories.
And it's always phrased, are you white, non-Latino? And I'm like, what? I guess I'm that thing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, go to Cuba and you'll see why, or the Dominican Republic or whatever.
Spain,
but, but so in France, they have a very unusual concept of basically when they say they don't see race, they try to mean it as literally as possible. I think I'm going to get the details of this wrong, but to a first approximation, it's literally illegal to take statistics on race in France. The government does not do it. The government
so France is like the conservative colorblind ideal of nope, we're just moving past it.
Someone called Tucker Carlson.
The idea of it is that all Frenchmen are French, and that's it.
Okay. It's cultural. It's not
period.
ethnic, it's cultural. Yeah.
It's a cultural thing. If you're French, you're French. It doesn't matter if you're Black French, you're white French, you're whatever. And so that's one way to approach it. And again, I don't think this is literally true, but let's just say to a first approximation, they do not take statistics on race in France. And that leads to its own set of problems. You can see how there's an idealized sense in which that could be a great way to approach the problem, but there are practical senses in which that, French society has not solved race. So
famously
they have
pretty bad.
in
some respects. Yeah.
They still have racialized ghettos in France I think they call them benuelos or something like that. I'm going to mispronounce the word, but where immigrants live. And
my French listeners are going to be up in arms with me this time around.
There's still places where all the Black Frenchmen live and all the immigrants live, and they haven't solved the problem. So I wonder, my question, Andrea, would be, is that a preferable solution, or is there no great solution beyond just the messy process of history that we slowly get better at this stuff, hopefully?
I feel like I won't comment on the fact that we're using the great solution as language around all of this, but there are things we could do. So I'm biased because I make a living with demographic data in companies. That's the kind of data science research that I do. And so if it was it's illegal, race statistics, it was well, I'm out of work. That's literally what I spend a lot of my time doing. I don't think that that's the answer. And my reasoning for that is that in the US, we do have protected categories that you cannot ask about. And so while we can ask about race and gender, and in some cases you have to if you're a company over a certain size with a couple of other things, I've helped companies design and execute diversity, in quotes, surveys where we look for various things, but we try to go beyond just what does someone look like. We say, did your family struggle with money growing up? Are you facing student debt? And we wanted to put some things like chronic illness, mental health, disability status, and a lot of other questions to better understand what was going on and underscore that diversity at this company means 25 different things as a starting point. And their legal team at this particular company was you cannot ask about a number of things. And two that really stood out to me were we cannot ask about religion and we cannot ask about disability or mental health type stuff. And that was over two questions, but they kind of lumped it into one.
HIPAA, probably, right?
To an extent, though, if you're self-disclosing, it's something. But they were like, they're protected categories, and so the risk is that if the company knows that you're Muslim or you have depression or whatever, then the company could be held accountable for discrimination and thus could get in trouble if they fire you, because you can say, well, I told you I was Muslim and then you fired me. And that really stood out to me. So we just deleted those questions and we didn't ask those things, and we asked other stuff. But it is interesting because it means the company has no idea where they are on religious diversity or mental health diversity or whatever else. And so they can't address the issues or do anything to support. Maybe everyone in the Florida office has anxiety. You could do something to help them. Whether that's the company's job is a whole other question, right? You can't acknowledge religious holidays in a way of inclusivity, all these other things. And so the French example just sounds to me like that applied to the question of race. And I think in the short term, it certainly resolves a lot of ugly categorizing and counting and arguing. But in the long term, it just means you're not doing anything about it, right? It's like almost the same argument that Trump gave when he was like, well, let's just not do more COVID tests and we won't have COVID.
I'd like to put in to split this, though. I think we can make a distinction between diagnostics and prescriptions based on race. Diagnostics based on race can be very helpful. Prescriptions based on race scare me. So a diagnostic based on race would be going, we know that poverty is much more correlated with the African American experience than the white experience in the United States. Okay, that's a useful thing to know. And there might very well be systemic racism still in place. I will argue there is. Jeremiah, we can go on a tirade together about zoning laws and about stuff in Los Angeles specifically.
Please.
I know that we're on board about that. And we go, okay, that is something that's having that effect there. Once we get into the prescriptions, though, that's where I go, okay, yay, France, right? So if we're going to go, we are therefore going to give rights or privileges based on people's race in order to try and rectify this gap. That, to me, is frankly abhorrent. I don't mind changing the system. A lot of the time we need to reform the system, but I want it to be universally applicable to everybody without awarding rights or privileges based on something beyond their control. And for that reason, I'm more concerned when we get into that kind of stuff with having government action more correlated with socioeconomic identity than with racial identity, because I'm more concerned with the people that are just impoverished and suffering, regardless of whether they're a white guy in a trailer park or they're a black guy in an inner city, than something that is phenotypical and not something they can control.
So let me say two things about this. I think the first thing is that it's a lot easier for people who are on the political right to kind of take that stance, because the political right does tend to operate more around what I would call ideological identities. This is as opposed to race or gender or like identifier identities, inherent characteristics.
Okay.
And I don't think this is because they're necessarily better people. I think that in the current iteration of our politics, it's simply because you can't literally come out and say, I'm the white person who's advocating for white people and white people only, and I'm the straight. You can, but it's going to marginalize you. Even Donald Trump doesn't come out and say that, even though he winks at it in 50 different directions. Even Trump will not literally come out and say, white people care about me. Because it's just taboo in a way that saying I'm trying to represent black people is not taboo. Saying I'm the representative for all white people is very much taboo. And you can make similar arguments for straight and man and things like that. So it's more convenient for people on the right to make that argument because they already can't access that. So they'd prefer that nobody be able to access that. And there's good reasons for that imbalance historically. The history of the United States is by and large a history of white supremacy. And that phrase makes people uncomfortable. But, for the first 200 years of the American experience, we were a slave society. We had racialized slavery. And then for, another 100 years after that, we had institutionalized racism where Jim Crow laws and all that kept black people down, literally. And now for about 60 years past that, we haven't had formal legalized racism, but we've still had discrimination and a lot of things that lasted up into the present day and still kind of continue. And things have gradually gotten better over time, most people will tell you. But I just want to point out, number one, there is a reason that people feel the need to say, like, I have to speak up for black people specifically. And you could do the same thing again for women, that for most of history, it's been shittier to be a woman than to be a man. And there's reasons people feel like they have to speak up specifically for women in a way that it's kind of taboo to speak up for men. So I don't know. I want to point out that while in the abstract, I agree that it's better to go off fundamental principles than it is to say, like, let's just help this one group of people. There are valid historical reasons why people have felt compelled to do that.
Yeah.
Is the only thing I want to point out.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think you can certainly look and go, okay, there's multi-generational impoverishment that's gone on with certain communities in the United States. African Americans were, after slavery, discluded from getting mortgages and things like that, which meant that even after they've been, quote unquote, liberated, they were not getting the same multi-generational wealth accumulation that a lot of the rest of that's all true, right? That being said, this may not be what you're saying, Jeremiah, but I want to be very clear on this. Like, when I say that I want to treat everybody the same and have an equality of law in terms of rights and privileges, economic, judicial, or otherwise, it's not a smokescreen where I'm like, man, I can't come out and say I'm white and I just want to help white people. How do I? And I'm willing to, for the conservatives that were invoked, I know quite a few of them that would feel the same way. And I think part of the rancor that we have right now in the country, which is weirdly a good thing, is that a substantial amount of the American electorate truly does find racism abhorrent. And part of the problem is that we are actually disagreeing on the definition of racism. And a lot of this boils down to equality in terms of law or equality in terms of outcome. A lot of the time it's phrased, if you're going to economics, equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. But for somebody like me, you could take a policy and say, even though this policy is race neutral, it is benefiting one race in its outcome. And I could go, okay, well, we can change that policy. But if you said we want to treat white people and black people differently in this policy, that immediately makes me go, well, that's racist based on my definition. If I'm going to say that race is, rights and privileges according to skin color. So I don't think that it's necessarily a smokescreen, at least in my experience, at that of my conservative friends.
So 2 quick things on that. First, to plug, and I think, Heaton, I've mentioned this person to you before, a friend of mine from grad school. Her name is Ashley Jardina. She's a professor of political science at Duke. Does research on white identity politics. And in particular, her research, and this was a rare thing when we were in graduate school, you would do racial identity, and basically you studied every race except for white people. And a big reason for that, let me just be very clear, is that the default studies were all white. So there was no need to study white people because everyone
there's almost a weird view that like white people don't have race.
Well, exactly.
Sometimes.
And so Ashley's work, I think, was very ahead of her time, and is now quite widely recognized, and it's been written about in various places, where she exactly is doing this, where she's documenting the rise of whiteness as an identity. And I think, Jeremiah, to your point that there are topics that are taboo, and generally saying like my identity as a white person is not something that we do. We might talk about our identity as
my heart rate went up when you said that. I was just like, oh man, I got to get the hood.
Yeah. I'm getting a sunburn from this light just talking about it. And male and straight and all these things. And I think they shouldn't be taboo because the experience of straight white men in this country is something that is a valid experience just like any other. And it is tough to be a straight white man in a lot of ways. And I think it's okay to talk about that. But even saying that, I'm like, don't put that clip out on its own. Okay, just so you know. But the second thing I want to say is that I think maybe to kind of stitch together some of what you both are saying, tell me if I'm missing this, is one way I think about I think, Heaton, your distinction on prescriptive versus descriptive is exactly the right one. And one thing I say to my consulting clients when they say, well, how do I get more black people in leadership, right? That's the dependent variable if you're a statistics person. So the dependent variable, the thing you're trying to explain or increase or understand, right, is more diversity, whether that's race or gender or religion or whatever else. And then the independent variables are the levers that might cause that to go up. And so often what happens is companies get fixated, which sounds like Joe Biden has gotten fixated, and a lot of us have gotten fixated, and that's when we say identity politics, is we're just trying to move the dependent variable without adjusting any of the structural, systematic, legal, policy, opportunities, and all these other things that actually could drive that up. And a similar analogy, and I am not a nutritionist, and I'm going to sound like I'm fat phobic, but a similar analogy is if you're trying to lose weight, don't focus on what's on the scale. Focus on what you're eating and what you're exercising and what you're blah, 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 blah. Like, To me, that's the analogy. It's like you get hyper focused on like what the scale is saying, or how many black people are on your board or your C-suite, but you never pay attention to what's actually causing those numbers to change. And that, I think, is do the describing as a level of accountability, and then I say to companies, like, set those numbers aside and look at them again in a year, right?
Andrea, can I give you an example of, I think, what you're talking about?
Yes.
To make sure that because that's a powerful concept that you just outlined for us. So somebody like me who is inclined to have neutral policies in regard to identity, I think can be mistaken in terms of the outcome. What I mean by that is if we had zero parental leave at a company, there's just no parental leave whatsoever. That is a gender neutral policy because there are no rights or privileges. So by my standards, that would not be sexist. However, somebody could rightly come in and say, while being true, Heaton, disproportionately, the pregnancies which happen at our company are held by women. So even though the policy is gender neutral, the outcome is not gender neutral. To which I would respond, okay, well, the gender neutral way of having this policy would be to have parental leave as opposed to maternal leave or something like that. But I can see how, but the dependent variable would be the women are not advancing in the company because there is no maternity leave. And then the Heaton colorblind gender neutral solution would be, okay, everybody gets parental leave. Yeah. That way we don't have to award rights or privileges based on gender.
Which a lot of companies are doing and is helpful.
Which I think the equitable way to handle it. The other thing that pops into my head, Andrea, because we're in the world of comedy, I don't know how many improv friends you have, but I being an amphibian, straddle the realms of both stand-up and improv.
I started in improv, so I have a few years on. Yeah.
Well, UCB, the Upright Citizens Brigade, would just flagellate itself constantly on how racist it was for the lack of people of color in the ranks. And I would come in and go, this is literally the most like neon woke environment I've ever been in my entire life. And it was, I looked at it and I'm like, I think it's probably socioeconomic and like all these things where I was looking at this
UCB
going like,
costs
it's not
$1 million.
Right. It's not because you guys are racist. It's because pretending to be a beaver at a classroom at 2:00 on a Thursday is something that white people that went to private schools tend to do. It's not something that somebody.
I want to hear the continuation of that story, by the way.
Yeah.
So I've been monologuing for a minute, Jeremiah. I'll let you get a word in edgewise about some of these distinctions.
I mean, look, I don't worry about this too much, honestly, because when I think about the grand questions of identity that I think are important in American politics, the fact that Joe Biden has made this explicit promise to nominate a black woman, I think it's kind of a little bit of a political own goal, but like ultimately, I don't think it's a bad thing that it's happening. There are plenty of qualified black women, and there's never been a black woman on the court, and sure, fine. To me, the Supreme Court is more of a thing where it's not really a question of nominating the best person. It's really like there's a bar you have to clear, and there's probably 25, 35, 45 people who clear that bar. They have the requisite academic and judge experience, and pass the bar, anybody's going to be qualified. And so you can pick from among that pool, and it's not like one of them is so much more legal than the other one that I don't know. To me, it's more, did you clear the bar to be qualified rather than there is a single best candidate. So, with the people he's looking at, I think it's fine. I guess when I think about how identity works in American politics, I've kind of just moved on to the broader questions of the way that tribalism has taken over everything that's not just your race and your gender. Tribal politics go back as far as literal tribes of cavemen hitting each other in the head with clubs. As long as human history has existed, there's been tribalism. But the way that it's taken over everything these days is an interesting thing where, I talked earlier about like the emojis on Twitter, which is a little funny to talk about, that there's a YIMBY emoji. All the YIMBYs put an avocado in their Twitter bios. But that's a real thing. And we have this increasing phenomenon where everyone has an identity based on what they believe, rather than just their immutable characteristics. And this comes with every form of tribalism. It means they have an in-group and an out-group. It means they have people they hate. It means they have sacred texts. Even if you're a neoliberal and your sacred text is Why Nations Fail by Darren Asamoah and James Robinson,
Asamoah's awesome.
there's
They're both
literally
awesome.
there's songs that people sing. The rationalist community has literal songs. I remember there was Julia Galef, who I know you've had on your show, I think, Andrew.
I'm a big fan. I really like Julia Galef.
Wrote a book called The Scout Mindset, and she talked about how breastfeeding mothers got into these giant culture wars with non-breastfeeders. She talked about how Bayesian statistics people had literal songs and chants that they would use against non-Bayesian statisticians. There were songs about Bayesianism. And tell me that tribalism is not taking over everything. When you hear examples like this, everything becomes an identity. Everything is tribal. You've got your in-group, your out-group, your symbols, your iconography, your holy texts. It's all this is what
Very
fascinates me, that things like breastfeeding and Bayesian statistics and YIMBYism are now tribal. And I spend most of my time trying to figure out what that does to modern politics.
Hey,
So
back at you.
You have a few thoughts on tribalism, don't you?
I happen to have written the rough draft of a book tentatively titled "Tribalism is Dumb," which I hope to find a reputable publisher for.
Well, the world is going to be dumb then, because it's everywhere.
Yeah, well, it is, and it's a great point you bring up, Jeremiah, and I almost wish just for people that had a similar reaction to the word identity politics that I did, if we just said political tribalism, which is more or less the term that you're using it in, it would have had a slightly different intonation at the beginning of the program. But I'm with you on this. I think we have become very tribal. Having put in a lot of thought on this, I don't think you can eradicate it. I think this is my theory. I think tribalism is basically like horniness. That is to say, it's innate. It's not something
Andrew,
that.
Is this a you problem or?
Is this
Let me
about
rephrase.
Valentine's Day again? What are we talking about?
Tribalism. We'll go back further. We'll go back to the bugs. Tribalism's like hunger. That is to say that it is a presupposed innate state that is not. It is not that it doesn't exist until invoked by an external presence. It is an internal presence that can be exacerbated by external stimuli. And I think tribalism works much the same way, that there are tribalisms there. Everybody has it. It can definitely be exacerbated by things like politics and football games, but there's some amount of it. The trick to me seems to have a Venn diagram approach to life. I think that's the way to do it, is almost to take a Montaigne, balancing against itself type of thing. If you have a unitary monoculture identity, you're going to be insufferable at cocktail parties. I don't want to hang out with you if you only have one identity, because that's the only thing you're going to want to talk about. And the other problem is you're going to see the entire world very likely as a conflict with somebody else. Politics is the worst, because politics is inherently Manichaean.
Mm-hmm.
Politics is predicated on my tribe's animated by beating your tribe. Whereas
Can I jump in here for a sec? Just to reinforce a point you made. Ezra Klein talks about this in his book Why We're Polarized, that one of the reasons he thinks that America's become more polarized and our politics is more poisonous these days is that while we used to have overlapping identities that conflicted, you would be a Southerner and a Democrat and a conservative and a labor
Catholic,
union, and a Catholic and a labor union guy. And these would kind of pull you in different directions. You're a rural conservative man that kind of predisposes you one way, but you're in a labor union. And, in your county, the labor unions have always gone Democratic. That pulls you another way. That's what American politics used to be like. But increasingly, everything is kind of brought up in this one universal culture war. That increasingly there's not a single issue as much as there is an all-encompassing culture war that takes everything. The NRA is no longer really a gun rights organization as much as they are a generalized conservative body. And, the New York City Pride, this is something I wrote about. New York City Pride is not an LGBT group anymore. They are a generalized progressive group. How do I know this? Because the Gay Officers Action League the goal is a group of gay New York City policemen, and they were kicked out of Pride. They kicked a gay organization out of Pride because it conflicted with another part of the progressive identity.
Right.
And so this is Ezra's point, is that now, rather than having these overlapping things where you're pulled in a lot of directions, it's kind of healthy. You have one overwhelming group of identities that all overlap on the left, and one overwhelming group of identities that all overlap on the right. Yeah. And that's much less healthy.
So not to be dismissive of Ezra Klein, but Ezra is building on an idea called party sorting, which comes from Morris Fiorina. And I think Heaton, every single time we're on a podcast together,
we always bring up
what show it is.
We need to invite him to like a joint birthday party or something.
Maybe he can come
always
to
bring up Morris
and eat
Fiorina.
some bugs. But that's the idea, right? Is that we used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and we all had more overlapping stuff, and so we had things that we could agree with each other on, and now those things are gone.
Yeah, well, I think that Ezra Klein's point, which I agree with Jeremiah, I think is kind of that on a macro level, because it would seem to me that if you were to go back 30 years ago into certain parts of the United States right now, I mean, it's also worth noting that we all work in media, or we all work in politics, academia, or media, which tend to be very sorted areas where people really think about this stuff, if not are living in an echo chamber. If you go back, 40 years, we're both at the Catholic Church. Yes, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat, but the thing that's probably more important to us is that we're Catholic. Yeah. Or it might well be that, right after 9/11, we're both New Yorkers. I don't care that you voted for Giuliani and I voted for, I assume, a Cuomo of some breed. But there are these different things, and those overlapping identities that you bring up, Jeremiah, allow you to humanize people you disagree with, because you know that you have commonalities with them. But when it becomes a monoculture, you lack those things, and so you can other them and externalize them and make them cartoons.
And there's numbers on this. Not just to say this very quickly, you can put data behind this. That what percentage of the time does a state that votes for a presidential candidate elect somebody different to the Senate, or a congressional district? How correlated is Biden's performance in a congressional district with whoever the Democrat candidate is? That has gotten way higher over time. There's way less cross-party voting than there used to be, which is just a sign that kind of the culture war has encompassed everything, and now there's this very nationalized politics, and regional politics are kind of dying in a sense.
That said, there is some evidence to suggest that one of the reasons you don't see cross-party voting anymore, this is a counter argument, I don't know if they're right, is that we see candidates who are more extreme because they think that they need to be more extreme in order to get the attention. And so it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're not going to cross over because the person who's on the right is so far to the right that even if the guy on the left is too far left for you, you're not going to go that far. So the polarization at the top makes it look like we're bardic. Anyway. But I bring all of that up to say that, Jeremiah, I'm so glad you said that about data. You can even show it without data, which is, I know, what everyone wants to hear about. But one of my favorite papers of all time is a paper by Robert Axelrod, who was my dissertation advisor, called The Dissemination of Culture, a Model with Local Convergence and Global Polarization. And what he did was he just built a very, very small, simple computer model of agents, so people in a society, who had 10 different personality traits or political beliefs or attributes or whatever it is that you want, right? Like abortion, guns, this, and everyone was given a number. And you basically just simulate and say, what if I only talk to people who have numbers within some range of my own numbers? And what if I let that go until forever? And basically what happens is if we only keep reinforcing and we stop having things in common with one another, you get into this locked-in state. And the haunting conclusion is there's no way out without really disrupting the system. So he would simulate it over and over and over and over again with all kinds of different perturbations at the beginning. And as long as we kept playing this tribalism game where the more I talked to someone, the more I became like them, and the more different I was from someone, the less likely I was to talk to them, you would end up in these what we have now, which is basically a stalemate. So the chilling thing is I don't know what it looks like to get out. We just jigger the whole system like a boggle board.
I think there's two, it's a massively large abstract problem to try and tackle, but I see two things that could help. Yeah. One, I do think that I agree to the counterpoint you brought up earlier, Andrea, of parties going extreme. And I think that that's a structural problem. I think that because we have closed primaries and first past the poll systems, incumbents and candidates are always going to play to the extremists in their party, rather to the moderates of their party, the non-aligned, or people in other parties. So that's going to always exacerbate polarization, and you're not going to be able to fix that unless you have electoral reform, a la ranked choice voting and top 5 open primaries.
Approval voting. All right.
So approval voting.
That's the other thing we always talk about when we're together.
So I think that's a structural problem that is going to keep happening with partisan politics until we change the system. But the other corollary to that culturally is much more difficult to do, because as our good friend Morris Fiorina would point out, the partisan sorting which has occurred at the level of politicians and media. It's not occurred all the way down. That is to say that most Americans, from a polling perspective, are not actually more polarized than they've ever been. It's just that they're better sorted, right? But I do think one of the problems culturally that is happening right now that I'm aware of, and I'm not entirely sure how to fix, is I think we are living in a very disconnected, alienating time. And people feel adrift. They don't feel like they belong. They probably demonstrably, this is old Robert Putnam stuff, but it feels anecdotally true, and I think it's been backed up by Carney and a few other people, that just the civic engagement in, man, I'm getting nerdy here, in intermediate civil institutions, which is to say things that are not government, like church, Elks Lodge, Rotary Club, gardening club, book club. Those numbers have declined over the last few years. And my suspicion is that being innately tribal mammal animals, that as we feel like we're not a part of a group, we crave that, and we're apt to latch on to whatever affords us that. And right now, the last man standing is politics, because politics can give you purpose, direction, enemy, and coalition. And I find that very disturbing, because the more invested your ego is in that, the less intellectually nimble you're going to be, and the more of just a kind of a Galef-style warrior or gladiator, as opposed to a mental scout or a problem solver. And also, again, how insufferable you will be at cocktail parties, because you will view your holy duty as destroying the other team.
Well, and that's exactly what Jeremiah was saying with the Bayesian versus frequentist statisticians at war with one another. If that's your identity, you're never going to actually do something useful or decide which one is useful when, and all those other things. But the other thing that's scary is, and I think also Jeremiah and Ezra were making this point, is that we have less and less in common when it comes to what media we consume and I'm not a sports person, but I feel like sports are the last thing, and maybe Game of Thrones until it sucked, right? Were the last things that Americans had in common. Because you look at these studies and you say, well, what shows are people in this region watching? What shows are people who voted for Trump watching? And they're not the same show, or we're not even consuming the same anything. It's not even that the politics is different. And the only other thing
I have bad news. It's it's just sports. It's not even I enjoyed Game of Thrones, but when you look at the numbers, like, people were watching 2.5 Men way more than they were watching Game of Thrones.
Yeah, see, that's my own
Game of
liberal
Thrones
bubble.
People aren't watching 2.5 Men.
But
sports, yes, please continue.
Sports is one. And then the only thing I was going to say was just to underscore your point about belonging. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because belonging is like tribalism before it goes bad. And it's exactly, it's one of the deepest things that humans need, is to feel that you belong, whether you're with a community or with just that's like, and it's something that we crave. And I think you said craving and hunger and all those things. And so one thing I don't know is, when does belonging end and tribalism begin? Is it when you don't have that overlappingness? Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, and I turn this back to partisan politics, where, look, I'm a Democrat and I operate in Democratic circles. That's the political calculation I've made, is that I'm trying to make my mark on society through the organs of the Democratic Party in one way or another.
I like being irrelevant.
So I've chosen a side because I think it gives me the best chance to actually make change happen. You've got to pick a camp and try to work through them.
I've chosen a side because I'm lazy. So,
but when I look at this and I think about what should Democrats be doing, I think that, like, Joe Biden needs to do as much red tribe signaling as he can, because, like, look, there's gonna be enough blue tribe signaling and he does a ton of it, even though he's kind of the most moderate of all the Democrats who ran for president in 2020. He was the single most moderate, and that benefited him a lot, because people didn't believe the attacks that Joe Biden is a radical socialist, because they can see Joe Biden. Like, it doesn't stick. So, when I think about this,
it helps that he sounds like he actually likes America. Like when
Yeah,
you
no,
listen to Joe
I
Biden,
was about to
you
get
get
to
the
that,
impression he
yeah.
would voluntarily live here, whereas a lot of Democrats talk about America like it's an uncle they're stuck with.
Yeah.
Like, they're like, of course I wish I were born in Canada, but I'm here, so let's fucking make it
Yeah.
work with all the
Well, see,
bigots.
I love that, like, I think we need Democrats who embrace a sort of liberal patriotism that, like, I think it's really dangerous for America if patriotism becomes a thing exclusively on the right, or if it becomes a thing where to be patriotic, people accuse you of nationalism. There's the fine line between those two things sometimes, but we need in the Democratic Party more extremely patriotic, rah America politicians if we want to win, frankly.
Should we all put American flag emojis quick next to our Twitter handles? Is that step one?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Although that is people are going to get mad at you because they assume when they see like an American flag emoji in your Twitter handle, they're going to make assumptions about you. That's how Twitter works these days.
That I was
like,
at January 6th. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to wrap up here in a second. I just on a sheer political level, Jeremiah, I think you're very right about that. Where like I find it being politically amphibious, having lived in New York, living in Austin, being from Oklahoma, having lots of friends who are progressives, having lots of friends that are conservative. I'm sort of amazed at the inability to talk between the two groups a lot of the time. So like I think I've mentioned this on my podcast before. If not, I did it on somebody else's. But like if I were selling solar panels to a Texan, I would not begin the conversation by going, you know how capitalism's ruining Mother Earth, who's being raped, and if only we could, but we could defeat capitalism by embracing the inner. I watched a Lena Dunham video about and it's like, what are you doing? Like what I would do if I were I live in Texas. If I were selling a solar panel to Texas, I'd be like, is your house off the grid? I'm self-reliant. Are you self-reliant? That's how I would do it. I would appeal to things that Texans like, rather than going like, hey, guy I hate. Quit, but it's same thing with on the other way around. Like you're not going to appeal to progressives by basically making a cartoon character of them and all of these things. And yes, it's weird how that is a moment in our political discourse. All right, I think I ran out of ground because I went too far. Should we go ahead and wrap up at this point?
Any podcast conversation that ends with the word discourse is a success in my book. So
that's true. That's true. We covered a lot. We covered eating bugs, which apparently I'm doing when I visit New York. Jeremiah, let me think. I got to make a plug for that. I'll make a note for that on my show to see how many bugs we can get me to eat based on the political orphans rallying for a good cause. And
you should do number of
charity.
bugs.
The charity is Against Malaria Foundation, by the way. If anybody does want to donate, that's what we're looking at.
Wait,
also,
the name of it's
why aren't
Against
you
Malaria?
Mosquitoes. Doesn't that help the cause?
Good point. Yeah. No, Andrea brings up a good point. Anne had a way better joke than I did. So good job, Andrea. We were going to go with that one.
Also, Heaton, yours should be because so you did a threshold model, right, Jeremiah? You said if you get 100,000, I'll eat some bugs.
Yeah.
Heaton, we could get interesting and do sort of, I don't know if you want to be linear or exponential. You'll eat bugs in proportion to how much money you make. I leave you to the model, but I would recommend something like that.
I think that's great.
So like if it's ranked choice voting against first past the post, you've got to make it a gradient of some kind.
Yeah, or I could have like $100 per bug, and if I get 100,000, then I have to eat 10,000 bugs. Is that right? That's what I'll do for the year.
Math was never his strong suit. We'll say.
Yeah,
it's a very
that's right.
Good source of lean protein. So
well, tell you what, I will. I'll work this out and do a plug for the charity thing on my show separately. But on that note, why don't we go around and say what our shows are? And Jeremiah, I think we have some crossover between our two audiences, so I'll plug some stuff I think your audience would like, and vice versa. So, Andrea, your show.
Sure, I'll plug some stuff no one's gonna like. I run a podcast called Majoring in Everything. It's about people who are sick and tired of being told to focus on one thing and are multi-talented generalists who do lots of awesome stuff. So Heaton was kind enough to be my guest a few weeks ago. We had a great conversation.
I love talking about myself.
Comedy,
and Andrea
politics.
said I got to do that. Yeah.
Yes. And so that's a lot of fun. And I also especially wish to plug my premiere of my one-person show on March 1st at Caveat in New York City and streaming online at caveat.nyc. It is called The Data Science Spectacular, and it is, I am claiming, I want someone to refute this, it is the best one-person comedy and circus accented show about data science in the world. All right. And so
You know what?
can
Now
come.
that
Yeah.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg's died, I think that's true.
I think I can do it.
She
Right.
had
So
the best one, but now, yeah.
if you have been wondering what data science is about and have been too afraid to ask and or anticipatorily bored by the answer, you can come to this show, caveat.nyc, and it's in person and online March 1st. And I'm on Twitter and all the other things at Jones-Rooy, JONESROOY, and you should come to my show.
I'm putting it in my calendar. I won't still be up there unless I'm still eating bugs. I will be back in Texas by that time, but I will watch it online.
Donate so Heaton eats enough bugs to stay and come to my show. Yeah.
I never thought I would hear the phrase data science through the lens of interpretive Cirque du Soleil style stunts. But apparently that exists, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, well, it will exist as of March 1st.
Jeremiah, I'll make a little bit of a plug to about you for my audience. So I host the Political Orphanage. Hence, there's quite a lot of miscreants, quite a lot of people that have not signed up for one of the two major parties. So noting that Jeremiah has outed himself as a Democrat, I believe Jeremiah and I stand lockstep on zoning tirades. I think if you've ever heard me talk about Euclidean zoning ordinances and minimum lot sizes, it comes up with a lot of stuff. I believe Jeremiah is doing God's work on that. He's doing the Lord's work, as are the neoliberals over there. And I find that you all tend to be, the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party tends to be the more of the regulatory hawk side of the party that I hope gains preeminence within that coalition. So, Jeremiah, the Neoliberal Podcast, any shows you've done recently you want to mention?
Sure. I mean, so we do a lot of stuff. We do deep dives on particular areas of policy or just political issues that are coming up. We've done one recently on the big tech antitrust bills that are making their way potentially through Congress and whether or not they make any sense. We've, talked about inflation, an episode on what's going on with inflation. We've got episodes on, crypto and what really is going to be the value out of cryptocurrency, if anything. So we've got a bunch of stuff like that. And if you're interested in that kind of deep dive political policy stuff, come check us out.
Nice. And I am Andrew Heaton, the host of the Political Orphanage. I'll make a pitch to your neoliberals, Jeremiah. So for the neoliberals, already having established my bona fides as a zoning hawk, I would like to bring up that I just did a two-part special on homelessness on the Political Orphanage, which did a lot of policy analysis. The first episode was very policy heavy. I think that you all would particularly like it as the neoliberals who compelled Jeremiah to eat bugs, because you are clearly policy-oriented people who also have an altruistic bent to you, and that episode is certainly that. So come check out the Political Orphanage. And I'll say this too, the political orphans for whom I speak on behalf of, we're totally an open relationship type organization. You can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican, you can be a Libertarian, come hang out.
They are very welcoming. As an out Democrat myself, I find that the Political Orphanage crowd accepts me for who I am, and I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Plus,
all right, well, hey,
your homelessness episode trended hard on Venmo. So someone Venmo'd you to say, "Oh, great episode," and I creepily commented on it. And so if you're trending on Venmo, you know it's a good episode. Good serious episode.
You know what? If I had to pick a platform to do well on, Venmo's the one that I would actually prefer. I'd rather do that than Snapchat. Well, gang, it has been a pleasure talking to you both. Andrea, it's good to see you. Jeremiah, good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.